It is commonly believed that the Vietnam War was waged only by the United States Armed Forces against the Communists of the North, but the reality was much different. As part of the Free World Military Assistance Forces, thousands of Spaniards, Australians, New Zealanders, Filipinos, and South Koreans served in Vietnam to support the US and the South Vietnamese. Among them, over 320,000 South Koreans joined the confrontation, reaching more than 50,000 at the height of their deployment. By 1972, the South Korean allies even outnumbered their American comrades. Most of the South Korean young volunteers came from their country's Marine Corps, and when communist forces spotted them in the jungle, they knew that the Korean Marines meant serious business. Time would only prove that they were a force to be reckoned with. Communism takes Asia. In the aftermath of World War II, communism spread quickly throughout Eastern Europe and most of Asia, and the territories that were previously occupied by the Imperial Army of Japan fell into Soviet control. In addition, countries that refused to accept the USSR were plagued with revolutionary guerrillas to destabilize their governments and weaken them. After a brutal civil war erupted in China during the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, Marxist ideas prevailed. The Korean Peninsula then followed in 1950. While the South was inclined to democracy and the influence of the United States, the North was consumed by Chinese communist ideas. Then, after 3 long years of conflict, a United Nations coalition led by the United States managed to push back the Northern Communist sympathizers beyond the 38th parallel and divided the country into 2 factions. North Korea became a communist state, backed up by the Chinese and the Soviet Union, while the Republic of South Korea adopted democracy and became an ally of the United States and most Western powers. As the Americans and the South Koreans were fighting the communists, the war in Vietnam was coming to an end in favor of the Marxist sympathizers of Ho Chi Minh. The French were ultimately forced to leave their colony after the decisive Battle of Dien Bien Phu, but the flames of war did not disappear so quickly from the countryside. The Vietnamese population was divided. Some were attracted to communism and the notions of returning to their national customs and traditions, while others preferred the Western way of life. A civil war broke out once again, and the first country to offer help was a nation that had just suffered the same fate, the Republic of South Korea. The Assistance Forces. As far back as 1954, the first president of South Korea, Syngman Rhee, offered military help to Vietnam to fend off the spread of communism, but his support was refused. The war in Korea was over, but peace had not been signed, which led to a stay of constant alert at the demilitarized zone with North Korea. With the United States increasing its support to Vietnam, President Rhee feared that the Americans would reduce the number of troops stationed at the border with Korea to help in Indochina. However, if he could send some of his own troops to aid the Vietnamese, Rhee believed he could demand a more significant American military presence in South Korea. Still, President Dwight D. Eisenhower rejected the South Korean offers of military assistance because he believed the American public would see it as a prelude to future American military presence in Vietnam. By the early 1960s, President John F. Kennedy also rejected the offers, as he believed that the conflict could be solved through peaceful means. The president limited the American presence in Vietnam by merely sending military advisors to train soldiers. It was not until 1964, when the fall of Vietnam into the hands of the communists was imminent, that the strategy changed and peace was no longer an option. However, while preparing his forces for military action in the Asian country, President Lyndon B. Johnson adopted a policy of foreign participation in the war. Johnson personally wrote to world leaders to ask for their support in the upcoming conflict, and this was part of the president's Many Flags initiatives. The objective was to gather international support for South Vietnam, which resulted in the Free World Military Assistance Forces, a group of troops from South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, the Philippines, and Spain. Out of them, only Spain would limit its support to military medical assistance, while the rest would go to war. Many more nations would later join the US side with more passive support roles. Finally, during the last months of 1964, South Vietnam asked South Korea for military assistance, and the nation didn't hesitate to help. Coming to terms. The reasons behind South Korea's insistence on sending troops to Vietnam dated back to the country's conditions after the Korean War. South Korea was devastated and bankrupt after the conflict. The population was starving, and its survival largely depended on foreign aid. When Army General Park Chung-hee took control of the government after a coup in 1961, he wished to turn the odds in his country's favor and turned to Japan as an inspiration. Japan had a miraculous economic recovery during the Korean War, and Park believed that the war in Vietnam would provide him with the same opportunities for his country. However, he could only achieve it if he proved that his nation had the stamina to fight its way out of a third world country. The only way to convince the US of getting more support for the economic recovery of South Korea was by proving that the Koreans were willing to fight shoulder to shoulder with the American soldiers. Park knew that the country could then count on military modernization, domestic help, and economic support. After Johnson and the Vietnamese government finally accepted South Korea's assistance, Park sent the first units in February of 1965. This brigade was known as the Dove Force and comprised engineers, military police, a Navy LST, and a MASH unit. The men were deployed to Bien Hoa, where they built roads, schools, and medical facilities to treat wounded civilians. More than 30,000 Vietnamese would be treated until the end of the war. Then, in June of 1965, Johnson asked Park if he could send more men to Vietnam, and he agreed under some conditions. The first and most important was to guarantee a stable number of American troops in Korea to protect the demilitarized zone. The second was that South Korea would limit itself to providing the men, but the US would provide them with military equipment and combat pay. And the third condition had to do with the chain of command, as Park insisted that his troops would only answer to their officers. The US agreed that the officers could retain tactical control of their units. Still, they would be subordinated to the authority of American officers in a combat zone. With these stipulated conditions, the volunteers then began to enlist by the thousands, but the South Korean military only picked the best. While many enlisted to honor the sacrifice of American soldiers during the Korean War, others saw it as a way to rise through the ranks and earn a stable income for their families. At the time, the average South Korean received less than $2 a month for his military service. In comparison, those fighting in Vietnam under American pay would receive about $37 a month. A combat legacy. In August of 1965, the South Korean Assembly authorized the deployment of troops in Vietnam, and by the fall, there were over 20,000 South Korean men stationed in the Vietnamese countryside. However, the Vietnamese government would ask for more troops only a few months later. The Tiger Division was a battle-tested unit that had fought alongside the Americans since the beginning of the Korean War. The men fought on the Pusan perimeter and became part of MacArthur's dashing counterattacks. They were the capital Tiger Division and the 2nd Marine Brigade, the Blue Dragons. Korea then created the 9th White Horse Division, increasing the number of deployed troops to over 45,000 men. General Chae Myung-shin, the commander of the South Korean forces in Vietnam, established the headquarters in Nha Trang to better coordinate with the Americans. President Park personally chose the officers sent to Vietnam to show the US that his men were more than capable of fighting. He also insisted that all of the men were volunteers. This push translated into highly trained and motivated men. Most of them wanted payback against the communists, while others wanted to prevent Vietnam from suffering what South Korea had endured during the Forgotten War. Every man was trained in the art of Taekwondo to master his body and turn him into a lethal opponent at close-quarters combat. The South Koreans were not just agile and tough, but also highly disciplined, and those who disobeyed orders were harshly punished. The US Marines would eventually incorporate Taekwondo into their combat programs after watching the South Koreans, or ROKs as they like to call them, handle themselves in combat. And several senior officers from the Tiger Division would teach the Marines the basics of this martial art during wartime. The South Koreans were better than the Americans at counterinsurgency operations. Although they did not speak Vietnamese, the Koreans understood their culture more than the US soldiers. They shared Buddhism as a religion and ate rice like the Vietnamese, which helped them relate with the locals when inspecting villages searching for Viet Cong. Still, these bonds did not prevent the Koreans from committing certain acts attributed to battlefield rage. Like the Americans, the Koreans were sometimes tricked by villagers that were communist sympathizers, which led them to terminate civilians when they felt betrayed. However, the ROKs from the Tiger Division were highly effective while in action. During combat in the Pho Cat Mountain, the ROKs finished over 3,000 enemies at the cost of just 300. The same occurred with the Marines from the Blue Dragon Brigade. During Operation Van Buren, the Marines and the 101st Airborne managed to secure over 30,000 tons of rice from the hands of 700 Viet Cong at the loss of just 45 men. The White Horse Division also got its fair share of combat, starting in 1967. As part of Operation Hang Kil Dong, they fought their way out of various Viet Cong ambushes and managed to down more than 200 men without losing a single of their own. One company of Marines would even earn a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions at Tran Binh Dong in 1967. The South Korean support would go as far as surpassing the number of American military personnel in Vietnam by 1972, reaching 50,000 men. Ultimately, over 320,000 brave Koreans would serve along with the Americans during the 10 long years of the Vietnam War, always feared by the enemy and ready to defend their honor. Thank you for watching our video. Please like and subscribe to our Dark Documentaries channels to find more exciting historical content. And let us know in the comments below what you think of the support from South Korea to the Americans in Vietnam.